Hello, this is Eric. Today is the 4th of January 2023, and we'll be talking about the colonial sugar society in Brazil and slavery. It is a dense topic, there's a lot to address here, and I ask you to please be patient. We're going to study a lot of details on this topic. I brought you some pictures, and I really did my best to try to provide you with information that normally is not discussed or is superficially discussed in schools or even in universities, right? So let's start here. So, what is the sugar cycle context? We got to understand that the sugar cycle was one of the main economic, social, and cultural bases in the colonial Brazil between the mid-16th and 18th centuries. This process was key for territorial occupation, which gradually formed much of what today represents the current geography of Brazil. So it is also really interesting to notice that the whole thing about the sugar cycle began with the Crusades, right? So through the Crusades, the Europeans had contact with the sugar cane, and through the European maritime expansion, we had this sugar market boom, this revolution, right? So when the Portuguese decided, right after the first expedition with Martin to Brazil, when the Portuguese decided really to invest heavily in Brazil, they had experience with the sugar plantation, right? Portugal began to develop sugar production on a larger scale from the mid-15th century onward in the territories of the Madeira Island, Azores, and, many other places. So they were not really starting to do something that they were not aware of. This was something they were experienced in doing. So the first sugar mill that we know about in Brazil is the one run by Pepo Capico in 1516. However, Martin Afonso de Souza around 1532 is the one who started the sugar revolution in Brazil. He built, the first official sugar mill structure in Brazil. And then it is important to remember that at the time what we had was a colonial pact. And that would benefit, the sugar mill structure in every possible way. Because Brazil basically existed only to feed the metropolis Portugal. So Portugal would buy things in Brazil through cheap prices, and they would sell, the manufactured product in Brazil at a much higher price. So it was a profitable business for Portugal. We're going to see ahead that the whole structure of the sugar mill was not entirely manufactured and maintained by the Portuguese. They did that associated with Holland, with the Dutch. But we're going to see more details about that in other classes, okay? So let's keep going here in this topic. So, the thing is that we had, obviously this sugar mill thing had to be run, by someone, and obviously it was hard work. So the Portuguese themselves obviously did not want to work, in the sugar system directly. They didn't want the heavy work. So they started basically enslaving the indigenous peoples in Brazil. If you remember the previous classes, I told you about the Brazil wood cycle. In that period, what we had basically was a barter scheme. That is, the Portuguese who were here in Brazil but that did not really have a high interest in the land, they exchanged such things as mirrors, axes, and that kind of thing for the Brazil wood that was interesting for them, right? However, in this other phase, in this other cycle, the sugar cycle, what we have here is not a quote-unquote harmonious relationship between the indigenous peoples and the Portuguese. No. Now the indigenous peoples were enslaved by the Portuguese, right? But we had, right in the beginning of this slavery process, we had the Jesuits, and we gotta really, we gotta go carefully here because there are many details I would like to discuss with you. So basically, as I said, the slavery in Brazil met the Portuguese's demand for manual workers, right? A type of work that the Portuguese despised. They didn't want to do that heavy work. So they started enslaving the indigenous peoples. And the slavery in Brazil was so cruel. And, the number of indigenous peoples that died was really high. First, as I said in the previous classes, the indigenous peoples died for many reasons. For the diseases, that the Europeans brought with them from Europe. And also because this slavery was cruel, right? Was inhumane. And I want to talk to you more about this. Let me see here. Well, the indigenous were the main slave labor of the Portuguese, right? Until the mid-17th century. Now, when the Jesuits came to Brazil, this thing of the indigenous slavery became complicated. So let's understand it step by step. Okay, first, the indigenous people, they were not familiar with the idea of continuous work to produce surplus, right? So although the indigenous peoples were easy prey and were much more accessible to the Portuguese settlers, as I said, many of the indigenous peoples died because of the diseases brought from Europe by the European conquerors, and they were not really used to this idea of producing surplus. That was something that had nothing to do with their lifestyle. They basically produced what they needed. They were not really thinking of surplus to be stocked, right? And also, as I said, when the Jesuits came to Brazil, when they started coming to Brazil from 1549 onward, then we have the onset of a conflict with the Portuguese settlers that were here. Why? Because the Jesuit priests, they saw the indigenous peoples as a herd, a potential herd to be converted to Catholicism. They were there basically to spread the Catholic faith, right? In Europe, you had that conflict between the Protestants and the Catholic Church, and so the Catholic Church was sending, the Jesuits to preach, the Catholic doctrine and to spread the domain of the Catholic Church. So when the Jesuits came here, they saw, the indigenous peoples as a herd, a potential herd to the Catholic Church. However, the Trailblazers, who were people that were in charge of entering into the territory, into the Brazilian territory, and finding slaves that could work in the mills and also that could do other things too as slaves. These Trailblazers, they had conflicts with the Jesuits. And it is very important. I'm going to give you as many details as I can, as I had already told you. And we got to analyze it from all perspectives possible, right? So, the Jesuits, they really defended the indigenous peoples, right? They encamped here. They have their missions, right? So they were also the ones that entered into the territory, right? So they were getting inside the territory, obviously through the help, through the aid of the indigenous peoples that knew the territory very well, right? So they also did this. It was not only the Trailblazers that really conquered the territory. The Jesuits also got inside the territory. So they built, these missions, and these missions were basically structures, like an army, because the fathers, the Jesuit fathers who came here, they had received a military training in Europe. So you had strict laws, you had rigid laws inside these missions. The indigenous that did not comply with the rules, they were disciplined. In some cases, they were banished, right? And the Trailblazers, as I said, they had conflicts with the Jesuits. It was very common to see Trailblazers attacking these missions, only to take the indigenous that were there captive with them, so that these indigenous could become slaves. That is something that you don't always hear, but that's the truth, because the Jesuits were always not always, but they are frequently painted as that, those gracious people that cared about the indigenous peoples. Oh yeah, they were against the indigenous slavery, but inside the missions they were harsh at the indigenous, right? And they used the indigenous as manpower to maintain those missions. That is something very important to say. So this situation continued for many and many years. In 1570, we had, the first preliminary victory to the Jesuits, because the indigenous enslavement was prohibited by law. However, that law was not complied with, not at all. So it took it took more than 2 centuries for the indigenous slavery to be totally and in practical terms banned, right? And that happened when the Marquis of Pombal in Portugal decided to, he officially decreed that the Jesuits should leave the Brazilian territory, and that the indigenous slavery would not be tolerated anymore. So that happened in 1757. So you basically had more than 2 centuries of indigenous slavery. So after that, and here you have a picture of these indigenous being made slaves, and that happened not only in Brazil, but also in the Spanish America. We have the same thing here. You have the Trailblazers basically capturing and taking with them, the indigenous to make them slaves, and they were cruel people. They not rarely raped the women, and they were really cruel men. They were evil, disgusting men, to say the least. So here you have this other picture of the conflicts between the Trailblazers and the Jesuits. And now this is something really interesting I wanted to talk about. This guy there is Father Antonio Vieira. Why am I showing you this picture? Because he's the connection between what I told you about the indigenous slavery and the consequent adoption of the African slavery. Right? So the African enslavement started in the 1550s, right? And it is very important to understand that the same church that was against the indigenous slavery, this same church was in favor and defended the African slavery. And this guy here that I showed you, Father Antonio Vieira, he wrote many sermons, and he was basically the pillar used by the Catholic Church to give foundation to the African slavery. Look at what he wrote, or what he said in one of his sermons that was registered to us. What you here is African slaves. What you must do is console yourselves greatly with these examples. Suffer the hardships of your state with great patience. Give many thanks to God for moderating the captivity into which He has brought you. He has brought you. So they said that God brought the Africans to be made as slaves in Brazil. And above all, take advantage of it to exchange it for the freedom and happiness of another life, which does not pass away like this one, but will last forever. So basically, what this guy said is that the indigenous slaves, they were pure creatures, and they could repent and be profitable to the church, by serving the Lord with the Catholic Church. However, the Africans, they were really, really lost. They had false gods in Africa, so the Lord brought them to America so that they, through slavery, through the hardships of slavery, could learn, could give thanks to God, and could, just like Jesus, I think I had an audio issue here. So just like Jesus suffered when he came here to earth and along his ministry, and then he was crucified, so just like Jesus, they should accept the hardships, and they should give thanks to God, because through this hardships they would be saved. So this transitory hardship here on earth, that would pass away, and they should look to eternal life. They should look forward to living forever in the paradise. Oh yeah. That's how the Catholic Church justified the African slavery in Brazil and banned the indigenous slavery in Brazil. Okay? So, Also, the Portuguese normally are the only ones that are considered guilty for the slavery, and that's not true. Yeah, they were cruel, cold-blooded, because the suffering that these African slaves were subject to was inhumane. So I can tell you with all the words, with all my might, these Portuguese, these settlers, they were cruel, disgusting, cold-blooded people. This is the sheep into which the slaves were basically tossed. And, many of them did not arrive in Brazil alive. Many of them died along the way because the conditions of the ship were precarious. But it is also important to notice that the only reason why these African slaves could be enslaved is because they were sold. They were sold by their very comrades in Africa. I mean, there were many conflicts between tribes in Africa. So the Portuguese formed alliances with some tribes, and they paid for these tribes to sell their enemies as slaves. So you see that really what is at stake here is the fact that the human conscience is the problem. It is fallen. It is corrupt. So that is not only an exclusivity of the Portuguese. No, this is something that encompasses all mankind. So not only were the Portuguese evil, cold-blooded, but also the tribes in Africa that sold these slaves, slaves from Angola, from Nigeria, they were sold by other Africans that were as evil as the Portuguese, because they knew exactly what kind of life, these African slaves would have, right? So, that said, we're gonna now talk about, the Africans' reality in Brazil. So they were brought here to work at the mills, at the sugar mills, right? And there, at the sugar mills, they had assorted roles, right? So I brought you a picture here. So basically, you have here, the picture of a sugar mill facility, right? You have here the big house. This is where the slave lord and his family lived, right? Here, the best slaves, the ones that received more care and the ones that did not rebel, they were selected to work inside his house and to serve, the slave lord and his family, right? But you also have here, this place where they would grow the sugar cane. You had the plantation, right? They not only work it with sugar cane, obviously, and they needed to eat. Here, you basically have the slave quarters. This is a place where the slaves would sleep on the hard floor in cruel conditions, and they were surveilled so that they could not flee. And the suffering was so harsh that it was not uncommon, it was not uncommon to see slaves committing suicide because of that. So in many cases, they didn't accept slavery passively. In some cases here, you had kings in Africa that had been sold as slaves, living and working here. So from the greatest in Africa to the smallest in Africa, all of these African slaves were slaves in Brazil, but they didn't accept slavery passively, right? So They fought. If they could, they would attack their slave lords, and so they had to be inspected and surveilled so that they would not flee. But some of them, and depending on the period, many of them would flee. And we're going to talk about that later in this class. And here you basically have the structure of the mill itself, where we have the production of many products derived from the sugar cane, like cachaça. You probably heard about that. This is a typical Brazilian drink, and other things as well. As sugar itself, obviously, that would be sold to the European market and to other markets as well. So it is also interesting to notice that the food, the slaves, basically the food they received was precarious. It was not enough for them to for them to survive. So since this food was poor and insufficient, the slaves needed to supplement it with the food obtained from a small crop that they cultivated on Sundays. So because of that, we have, for example, feijoada, which is food that many Brazilians eat and that even foreigners come to Brazil to eat, that looks fancy nowadays, but that was the food that was cooked from the rests that the slaves, got from this place where they worked, right? So, this is a picture of a slave lord with his slaves. This is another picture. Both are from the 19th century, right? So you see here, in some of these sugar mill structures, you could find even hundreds of slaves. And here, you're basically seeing a Flanders mask. As I said, in some cases, the slaves, when they could not flee, they would, in some cases, try to commit suicide because the hardship, the cruelty that they were treated with was really intense. So they committed suicide by ingesting earth, so they put this mask on them so that they could not commit suicide. So you see to what extent the cruelty of the settlers went to. So it's really, I don't have any words to describe that. It's sheer cruelty and cold-bloodedness. It's really hard to describe that. I don't know what to say. It's really amazing that even after centuries of that hardship, of that cruelty, there are people that do not realize that we have adapted with the African slaves here in Brazil. Society has adapted with them. Okay, it was not us in this generation that did that, but we have a historical debt as a nation towards these people. And it is amazing that not even seeing these pictures help, our politicians in some cases to acknowledge that. And we still have racism going on in our country. It's really absurd, and it disgusts me, So here we have, what is really interesting in this picture is that you see a black slave basically whipping another slave. As I said, there were many roles among the African slaves. So some would be involved with the with the hardest work, and others would, for example, work in the surveillance, in the inspection, would serve, the slave labor and his family in the big house, as I told you. So there were slaves that would go to the city to to take care of their lord's business. There were many roles. Along the classes, I'm going to be addressing these roles because they emerged along the history of slavery in Brazil. So as I said, the slaves did not accept, just like the indigenous peoples also did not accept slavery passively, so neither did the African slaves accept the slavery that was imposed to them passively. So we had some places called quilombos, right? These were places, these were structures that were built by slaves that fled from the sugar mills, right? So they were built as fortresses to resist any Portuguese settler that would want to go after them to make them slaves again. The most famous one in Brazil is certainly the Palmaris Colombo that existed from 1597 according to the best records, and that was destroyed in 1694. So it endured almost 1 century. So basically, you had the first leader of this Quilombo, that was Genga Zumba, right? And then, it is also important to say that the Quilombos worked as a refuge not only for African slaves, but you could see there indigenous peoples. You could see there also poor Portuguese, that would resort, to the Quilombos. And so the Portuguese expeditions became, very numerous after the Dutch withdrawal that we're going to study more ahead in our classes. So after the Dutch withdrew from Brazil, the Portuguese really focused on trying to eliminate these Quilombos. So at first, we had a great number of expeditions being made in 1654. They were not enough to destroy the Palmaris Colombo. Then you had a peace offering from Dom Pedro de Almeida in 1678. And then you had this evil trailblazer called Domingos Jorge Velho, that was hired by the Portuguese crown to destroy the Palmaris Colombo. So he made use even of cannons to complete the task, just for you to have an idea of the cruelty that they were willing to impose to the slaves. So in this period, what you had here was basically after the peace offering, you had a split between Genga Zumba and Zumbi dos Palmares, another leader, which is the one who is the one that became most famous, right? So Genga Zumba, quote unquote, accepted the peace offering, and later on, he was poisoned, probably by the Zumbi dos Palmares allies, right? This is what we believe that happened. So the Trailblazer, Domingos Jorge Velho, was hired to destroy the Palmaris Colombo. The Quilombo was destroyed in 1694. Zumbi dos Palmares fled, and he was denounced and found and executed in 1695. He was beheaded, and his head was kept at a square, to show what would happen to those that opposed the Portuguese crown. Okay, I'm showing you this picture because this is a very sad sign that even in the 21st century, we are not me and others that are, that understand the history of Brazil. But there are many Brazilians that do not understand the history of Brazil, that do not care about the history of Brazil and about the people that really suffered in Brazil. So they built this statue of a trailblazer called Borba Gato. And you can see him as a good guy, a hero, right? This is the way that he's portrayed here. And recently, this statue was burned, by people that are tired of seeing it here, as if the Trailblazers were good people, people that were important, that entered into the land and did something valuable. Actually, no. They were invaders, cruel people, cold-blooded people that raped women, that enslaved indigenous peoples, Africans, and that killed many and many people. So this is a statue showing these sort of people as heroes. This is really disgusting. And this is a statue of Zumbi dos Palmares. This is one that we can respect, right? So in the same territory, you have good statues and really bad statues, right? So this is what I had to tell you today. I hope you have enjoyed the class, and see you in our next class. Bye-bye.